Charles Darwin is credited with developing the modern theory of evolution. When this happened in the 1800s, his ideas were extremely revolutionary. Nobody was thinking this way when Charles Darwin first started proposing natural selection. So, as a kid, Charles Darwin loved nature, but his father saw no future for him as a naturalist. And so his father sent him to medical school, but Darwin found medical school boring and surgery was awful. At the time, there was no anesthesia, so he quit medical school. His father then enrolled him in Cambridge University to be a clergyman. The current ideas of the world at the time that he was taught at Cambridge were that the world and the species were only a few thousand years old, and that the species that are on Earth today were the same species that had been there when the Earth was developed, and that the Earth was not changing. Darwin developed new ideas that developed after college, so after graduating at Cambridge. He was hired as a naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle for a 5-year voyage around the world. You can see the voyage map up here in the picture on the right, and this is a picture of young Darwin. And so he took notes and carefully observed plants and animals throughout this voyage, and one thing he noted was that animals and plants matched their environment. So the things that they had that allowed them to survive matched very well with the environment that they were surviving in. So for example, this marine iguana down here, it has a flattened tail. So it's kind of laterally flattened like a fin. And this helps it swim in the water. But the rest of the iguana is extremely similar to the rest of the iguana that live on land. But the tail gives it an adaptation, it gives us an edge in the water. He visited many islands in the Galapagos. And what he noticed was that there were distinct species of tortoise on every island. So even though they looked similar, the fact that they had been on every island for so long they developed into separate species. And so he wondered what caused all of the differences in these different species. When he was on board during this journey, there was a very profound book published by authors Charles Lyell called The Principles of Geology. And this was one of the first publications that suggested that Earth was actually millions of years old and not just thousands of years old. And that it had been changing very slowly over all of that time. This really fit with what Darwin was seeing. He had collected fossils throughout this journey that didn't make any sense. So he had collected a fossil of a snail high up in the mountain in the Andes in the western South America here. But it doesn't really make sense for snails to live in mountains. But if the Earth has been changing over a long period of time, then perhaps these mountains weren't always mountains. They could have been a more aquatic environment that would have been more apt for that snail. So it was likely that they had not been mountains when the snail had died and fossilized, and that geological changes had turned what was probably more of a lowland wet environment into the Andes Mountains. So these reflections that Darwin had while he was on this journey really led to his idea of descent with modification. So Darwin came to the conclusion that organisms have been changing slowly over time. There were other people at the time who also thought this, but what made Darwin's mechanism stand out is that he had a mechanism for this change, which he called natural selection. He suggested that natural selection over many, many generations would lead to species who were well adapted to their environment. When he got back from his trip, he began writing all of these ideas into an essay, but he actually delayed publishing it because he was worried about the reception it would get in the scientific community of the day. But in 1858, another scientist, Alfred Wallace Russell, sent Darwin his ideas, and they were almost identical to Darwin's theory of natural selection. So this prompted Darwin to go ahead and finally publish his essay, And that led to the famous book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which you can see the original title of the cover right over here. So Darwin's book doesn't actually use the word evolution. He refers to evolution as descent with modification, meaning the descendants of parents are slightly different than their parents. His book does not say evolution. The idea is that species we see today are the descendants of ancestral species, and that over time they have changed. And so the species we see today are different than the species that were on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago.